If I fix your bike, can you keep me?
A 13-year-old kid walks into a biker garage with nothing but grease-stained hands and a desperate question. Just one shot to prove he belongs. What he doesn't know. This club doesn't just fix motorcycles, they rebuild broken lives. But first, he has to finish what his grandfather started. The bell above Thunder Fork's garage door didn't ring when Brian pushed through. It had been broken since March, same as half the things in this place. He stood there for a moment, backpack hanging off one shoulder, trying to look taller than his 13 years allowed. 3 men looked up from a disassembled Sportster. The closest one, bald with arms like tree trunks, set down his wrench slowly. "We're closed, kid." "No, you're not." Brian's voice cracked halfway through. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Sign says open till 6. It's 5:30. The bald man, Butcher, though Brian didn't know that yet, exchanged glances with the others. "You lost." "No, sir." Brian stepped further inside, boots leaving prints on the oil-stained concrete. His fingers were already black with grease, like he'd been working on something before he got here. "I'm looking for Rex." That got their attention. The man at the workbench straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his fingers. Rex stood at the workbench. Deep lines mapped his face, some from squinting at motor parts, others from decisions he probably regretted. "And who's asking?" Brian reached into his jacket. Too big for him, sleeves rolled twice, and pulled out a faded photograph. He held it up. "You knew my grandfather, James Carver. Rode with you back in the 90s. The garage went quiet except for the radio playing something low and scratchy in the corner. Rex took the photo, studied it for longer than necessary. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted. Jamie's grandson. Not a question. Heard he had a stroke couple weeks back. He's at County General. Room 247. They won't let me stay with him. Brian's jaw tightened. Social Services wants to ship me to Springfield. Group home. 300 miles from here. And you came here because? Brian turned and pointed to the corner of the garage, where a rust-covered Harley sat under a tarp covered in dust and spider webs. "Because I can fix that." Butcher actually laughed. "Kid, that bike's been sitting there for 6 years. 3 mechanics have looked at it. Engines seized, wirings shot, transmissions probably fused into one solid block of rust. It's a 1987 FXRS low rider, single cam, 5-speed. Carb needs rebuilding, but the real problem is whoever stored it didn't drain the fuel system. Gas turned to varnish, gummed up everything from the petcock to the injectors." Brian walked toward it like he was approaching something sacred. "You've also got a cracked primary case cover. See that oil pattern on the frame? And I'm betting the stator's corroded because somebody parked it near a water heater that leaked for months." The 3 men stared at him. Brian pulled the tarp back, ran his hand along the frame. His fingers stopped at a spot near the neck, traced something carved into the metal. His throat went tight. "JC 1989. Rex moved closer, crouched beside him. "Your grandfather rode that bike for 8 years. It was supposed to be his retirement gift to himself. He never finished restoring it." "I know." Brian's voice dropped to almost nothing. "He told me about it. Said he'd teach me how to bring it back. We were gonna do it together after I turned 14. He looked up at Rex, and his eyes were dry but fierce. "I'm out of time. Social workers coming Friday. If I don't have somewhere to go, somewhere stable, I'm gone. And I can't." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I can't leave him alone in that hospital." "So what are you proposing?" "I fix this bike. Prove I can earn my keep. You let me stay. I'll work, I'll clean, I'll do whatever needs doing. I just need a place until—" He didn't finish. Until what? Until his grandfather woke up? Until some miracle happened? Rex stood, crossed his arms. "You've got tools?" Brian shrugged off his backpack, unzipped it. The backpack clanked when it hit the floor. Wrenches spilled out, their chrome worn to bare steel. A socket set his grandfather had bought before Brian was born. Screwdrivers with wooden handles smoothed by decades of grip. His grandfather's tools. 48 hours. Rex said finally. You get that bike running, we'll talk about the rest. But you don't sleep here, you don't make a mess. And if you steal anything, I'll call the cops myself. Clear? Brian nodded so hard his neck cracked. Butcher, get him a work light and a stool. Kid's gonna need both. As the others drifted back to their projects, Brian knelt beside the Harley and began. He didn't know that Butcher would spend the next 2 days watching him from the corner, noting every technique, every careful movement. Didn't know that Millie would show up tomorrow with food and questions he wasn't ready to answer. All he knew was this: he had 48 hours to finish what his grandfather started. And he wasn't going to waste a single minute. 22 hours in, Brian's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd pulled the engine cases apart sometime after midnight, working under a single work light while the rest of the garage slept in darkness. The pistons came out easier than expected, but the cylinder walls were scored deep. Someone had run this engine hot and hard before parking it. Brian sat cross-legged on the concrete, parts laid out in careful order around him, each piece exactly where it needed to be, and tried to remember what his grandfather had taught him about salvaging damaged cylinders. You don't give up on something just because it's scarred, the old man had said once, hands steady despite the tremor that would come later. You find what's still good and build from there. Footsteps echoed from the office. Butcher emerged with 2 cups of coffee, set one beside Brian without a word. He lowered himself onto an upturned bucket, studying the disassembled engine. You know what you're doing with that? Butcher asked, not unkindly. Honing the cylinders. Got sandpaper in my bag, different grits. I'll work it smooth. Check the clearances. Hope the pistons still fit within spec. Brian took the coffee, burned his tongue, didn't care. If not, I'm screwed. Your grandpa teach you that? He taught me everything. Brian picked up a piston, turned it in the light. I was 6 the first time he let me hold a wrench. Told me bikes were like people. They'd tell you what was wrong if you knew how to listen. Butcher sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving the kid's hands. Those weren't the fingers of someone who'd learned from YouTube videos. The way Brian checked each component, the rhythm of his movements, the angle he held the parts to catch the light, that was muscle memory built over years. He was good, Butcher said finally. Best mechanic we ever had before he left. Brian's hands stopped. Why did he leave? You'd have to ask him that. Can't. He doesn't wake up anymore. Brian set down the piston carefully, like it weighed more than it should. Doctors say the stroke took most of his speech. Even if he opens his eyes, he won't be able to tell me anything. The garage door creaked open. A girl walked in, maybe 17, carrying a paper bag that smelled like breakfast. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and wore a university sweatshirt despite the heat. Millie, Butcher greeted. Thought you weren't coming till noon. Heard we had a situation. She looked at Brian, then at the scattered engine parts. You're the kid. Brian. Millie Restrepo. My dad's the club's attorney. She set the bag down, pulled out wrap sandwiches. Ate yet? Brian shook his head. She tossed him one, kept the other for herself, sat down on the floor across from him. So what's your plan here, Brian? You fix this bike. Then what? Then they let me stay. For how long? Until your grandfather gets better? Until you turn 18. She took a bite, chewed, waited. Because I saw the paperwork sticking out of your bag. The foster care placement form. It's dated for this Friday. Brian's jaw tightened. That's my business. It becomes everyone's business when Rex is considering harboring a minor without legal custody. Millie wasn't cruel about it, just matter of fact. I'm not trying to bust you. I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to make this work that doesn't end with everyone getting arrested. Butcher stood, stretched his back with a series of cracks. I'll let you two talk. Brian, take a break. You're no good to that engine if you pass out. After he left, Millie pulled out a notebook. Tell me about your situation. All of it. So Brian did. His mother died when he was 3. His grandfather raised him in a house that always smelled like motor oil and Old Spice. There wasn't anyone else. No aunts calling on birthdays, no cousins at Christmas. Just the 2 of them and whatever bike was torn apart in the garage. Just a 13-year-old kid who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep but couldn't stay in the only home he'd ever known because the state said a stroke victim couldn't be a guardian. Millie wrote notes, asked questions, didn't promise anything. When she finally closed the notebook, she said, "There might be something we can do. Emergency kinship placement, if we can find a relative willing to take temporary custody." Or, she hesitated. Rex has fostered before. Long time ago. If he still has his certification, and if he's willing, I don't need charity. No, you need a legal address and an adult signature. Millie stood, dusted off her jeans. Finish the bike first. Prove you're worth the trouble. Then we'll see what we can do. She left, taking the morning light with her. Brian turned back to the engine. 30 hours left. He picked up the sandpaper and started honing the first cylinder, counting strokes to keep his mind from wandering to hospital rooms and social workers and everything he couldn't control. The sun had climbed high enough to turn the garage into an oven. Sweat dripped into Brian's eyes as he worked, mixing with the grease until he couldn't tell where oil ended and exhaustion began. But stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant thinking about Friday, about Springfield, about losing the only family he had left. Around noon, he found it. The hidden compartment was behind a false panel in the frame, revealed only when he removed the damaged primary case. Inside was a small waterproof bag. Brian's hands trembled as he opened it. Photographs, dozens of them. Young men on motorcycles laughing at the camera. His grandfather among them, maybe 30 years old, with a full head of hair and a smile Brian had never seen on the old man's face. Rex was there too, lankier, less gray. And others, some Brian recognized as older versions of current club members. One photo stopped his breath. A woman holding a baby, his grandfather's arm around her shoulders. On the back, in faded ink, Sarah and little Brian, 1992. His mother, and him. Brian flipped through more photos. His grandfather at birthday parties, teaching a toddler to ride a tricycle, holding a little boy's hand at what looked like a funeral. Every major moment, documented and hidden inside this bike like a time capsule. The last photo was different. His grandfather alone, older now, standing in front of the Thunder Forks garage with the Harley beside him. On the back, never too late to come home. Brian sat there on the cold concrete, photos spread around him, and understood something he hadn't before. This bike wasn't just a restoration project. It was his grandfather's unfinished apology. And now it was Brian's inheritance. He'd been working for nearly 2 days straight. The deadline was close enough to taste. Brian's vision blurred as he torqued down the final cylinder head bolt. The engine was back together, every component cleaned, measured, installed with the precision his grandfather had drilled into him. His fingers were raw, 2 nails cracked from forcing a stubborn bearing race. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. The garage had filled up around sunset. Word had spread somehow, the kid trying to resurrect Jamie Carver's ghost bike. Men leaned against workbenches, arms crossed, watching. Not mocking, just waiting. Rex appeared beside him, wiping grease from a connecting rod he'd been working on. "Before you try starting that, need to tell you something." Brian didn't look up from the timing cover he was bolting on. "I'm almost done. Your grandfather didn't leave because he stopped caring about this club." Rex's voice carried across the quiet garage. "He left because he cared more about your mother. She was 16, pregnant, and the father was gone. Jamie had a choice. Stay here with us, or raise his daughter's kid alone." Brian's fingers stilled on the wrench. "We told him he could do both. Bring the baby around, let us help. But Jamie knew what we were back then. We weren't just a motorcycle club. We were into things that could have gotten that baby taken away. So he walked away from his patch, his bike, everything he'd built here, to give your mom a clean life." Rex paused. "And when she died, he did the same for you." Brian's throat burned. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not just fixing a bike. You're trying to finish something your grandfather started 20 years ago. Coming home. And I need you to understand what that means." Rex crouched down to eye level. "This club? We're not perfect. We've got history, debts, complications. If you stay here, you're choosing that life. So before you turn that key, you need to be sure this is what you want. I don't have anywhere else to go. That's not the same as choosing to be here. Brian looked at the Harley, then at the men watching from the shadows. Butcher with his scarred knuckles. Millie sitting on a stool in the corner, legal pad in her lap. Others whose names he didn't know but whose faces had become familiar over 2 days of borrowed time. My grandfather chose you once, Brian said quietly. Then he chose me. I'm choosing both. Rex nodded slowly, stood. Then finish it. Brian installed the last components with shaking hands. Fuel lines connected, battery terminals tightened, oil filled to the proper line. He'd rebuilt the carburetor twice to get it right, rewired the entire electrical system, replaced the clutch plates with spares Butcher had donated from his personal stash. Everything was perfect. It had to be. He climbed onto the seat, felt the weight of his grandfather's jacket on his shoulders, and turned the key. The fuel pump primed with a quiet hum. Good sign. He pulled in the clutch, thumbed the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, caught with a stuttering roar that filled the workspace like thunder. 3 seconds of the most beautiful sound Brian had ever heard. Then it died. He tried again. The starter cranked, the engine turned, but nothing caught. No spark, no combustion, just the mechanical grinding of parts moving without purpose. Come on! Come on! Brian's voice cracked. He ran through everything, fuel flowing, kill switch right, spark plug firing clean. Everything worked except the engine. He tried more times, each attempt weaker than the last as the battery drained. Nothing. Butcher moved closer, listening to the cranking sound. His expression changed. Kid, pop the timing cover. I already... Pop it. Brian's hands trembled as he removed the bolts he'd just installed. When the cover came off, his stomach dropped. The timing mark was 180 degrees off. He'd installed the gear backwards. Such a simple mistake. Something a first-year mechanic would catch. But Brian had been so tired, so desperate, so focused on getting everything perfect that he'd rushed the one thing you never rush. And now, with 6 hours left on Rex's deadline, he'd have to tear down half the engine to fix it. He couldn't do it in time. Brian's breath came in short gasps. He tried to hold it together, tried to think of a solution, tried to be the mechanic his grandfather had trained him to be. But he was 13 and exhausted and out of time, and the only home he had left was slipping through his oil-stained fingers. The photos from the hidden compartment sat on the workbench, his grandfather's young face smiling at ghosts. I'm sorry, Brian whispered. Not sure if he was talking to the old man in the hospital or the ghost in the photographs. I'm so sorry. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Butcher knelt beside him, toolbox already open. Your grandpa didn't teach you to finish bikes alone. He taught you to start them. The old mechanic's voice was rough and quiet at once. Now let me show you how we finish them together. Rex called out across the garage. Anyone got plans tonight? One by one, the men shook their heads. Good, Rex said. Let's bring this one home. They worked through the night like a surgical team. Butcher called out instructions while Brian's hands moved inside the engine. Timing pin goes in the upper hole, not the lower. Feel it. Got it. Brian's voice was hoarse but steady now. 2 other mechanics, Diesel and Crow, held work lights at angles Butcher specified. Millie brought coffee every hour, said nothing, just squeezed Brian's shoulder, and went back to her corner where she was drafting something on her laptop. Rex didn't work on the bike. He made phone calls, quiet conversations in the office that Brian tried not to think about. Hours later, past midnight, Butcher let Brian reinstall the timing gear himself. Slowly, triple-check the marks before you tighten anything. Brian's hands didn't shake anymore. He aligned the marks, checked them against the manual Diesel had pulled up on a tablet, checked them again with a flashlight at a different angle. Only when Butcher nodded did he torque the bolts to spec. They had the engine back together by the time dawn broke through the windows. First light was breaking through the garage windows when Brian climbed back onto the seat. The audience had grown. More club members had arrived in the night, summoned by texts and phone calls. They lined the walls watching something that mattered. Brian didn't pray. His grandfather had never been religious. But he thought about the old man's hands guiding his years of Sunday mornings in a garage that smelled like coffee and motor oil, the patient voice explaining that mechanics wasn't about forcing things. It was about understanding what wanted to happen and helping it along. He turned the key. The fuel pump hummed. He pulled in the clutch, took a breath that felt like it might be his last, and hit the starter. The engine turned once, twice, then it caught. A roar filled the garage, deep and clean and strong. The sound of 87 horsepower waking up after 6 years of silence. The whole workspace seemed to vibrate with it, and Brian felt the rumble through his legs, his chest, his bones. He gave it throttle. The engine responded perfectly, settling into a smooth idle that sounded like music. Someone cheered. Then everyone was cheering, hands clapping Brian's back, voices overlapping in celebration. But Brian just sat there, one hand on the grip, feeling the heartbeat of his grandfather's last unfinished dream. Rex walked over, had to lean close to be heard over the engine. "Shut it down. Let's talk." In the office, Millie was already waiting. She slid papers across the desk. "Hospital called an hour ago," Rex said. "Your grandfather's being transferred to the VA facility in Henderson. Better stroke care therapy programs. I pulled some strings through our veteran network." He paused. "As for you, Millie's been working on emergency placement paperwork. I still have my foster certification. It's expired, but she thinks we can expedite renewal." "How long will that take?" Brian's voice was small. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Too long for Friday's deadline. Rex looked at Millie. She picked up where he left off. "So we're filing for temporary emergency custody with the club as collective guardians. It's unusual, but there's precedent in kinship situations. You'd stay here, we'd document that you have stable housing and supervision, and we'd argue that removing you would cause undue hardship given your grandfather's condition and your established support system." "Will it work?" "Honestly, maybe. Judge Carrera owes my dad a favor, and she's sympathetic to veteran families." Millie met his eyes. "But you need to understand, this isn't a sure thing. If it falls through, you might still end up in Springfield." Brian looked at Rex. "And if it works, I stay here? For real? You earn your keep. Work the garage. Keep your grades up. Visit your grandfather every Sunday." Rex's expression was stern but not unkind. "This isn't charity, Brian. You're crew now. That means responsibilities." "I understand." "Good." Rex stood, walked to the window overlooking the garage floor. "Your grandfather sent me something about 2 years ago. Letter I never answered. He said he was getting old, that he wanted to make peace before it was too late. Said he had a grandson who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep." Rex turned back. "I didn't believe him. Figured it was just an old man bragging. Guess I was wrong." The social worker came that Friday. Millie met her in the office with a folder 2 inches thick, documentation of Brian's living situation, character references from club members, the emergency custody filing, medical records showing his grandfather's transfer, even a letter from Brian's GED prep instructor. The woman looked tired, overworked, carrying too many cases. She reviewed the papers, asked Brian questions about where he slept and whether he felt safe. She interviewed Rex, inspected the storage room that had become Brian's bedroom, small but clean, with an actual bed now instead of a cot. When she left, she didn't take Brian with her. 3 months later, Brian stood beside his grandfather's hospital bed. The old man's eyes were open but distant, his right side still paralyzed. Brian held his hand and told him about the bike, about Thunder Forks, about Butcher teaching him to properly gap spark plugs. "We got it running, Grandpa, just like you wanted." His grandfather's fingers twitched once. Maybe reflex, maybe recognition. 2 weeks after that, James Carver died peacefully in his sleep. They held the memorial at the garage. 20 bikes lined up outside, his grandfather's old Harley at the front with Brian in the seat. They rode to the cemetery together, then to the old lookout point where James used to take his daughter, where he'd taught Brian to skip stones in the creek below. Brian scattered the ashes there while the club stood silent behind him. Nobody mentioned patching Brian in. Not that day or in the weeks after. Life at Thunder Forks settled into something Brian had never had before, routine. He turned 14 covered in transmission fluid. 15 came during a heat wave, rebuilding an ironhead that fought him every step. By 16, he could diagnose problems by sound alone, just like his grandfather. On that birthday, he walked into the garage and stopped. A frame hung on the wall where vintage photos usually lived. His grandfather's original Thunder Forks patch, cleaned and preserved behind glass. Below it, a brass plate caught the morning light. Earned, not given. Welcome home. It was proof that some things were worth the 3 years it took to build them right. Brian stood there, reading those words, understanding finally what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Family wasn't about blood or patches or club colors. It was about showing up when someone needed you, about finishing what others started, about choosing to belong. Brian didn't just fix a motorcycle that night. He rebuilt a bridge between generations and found the family his grandfather never stopped believing in. What would you risk to prove you belong? Drop your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that remind us what family really means. See you in our next video.